All right. So the Holy Roman Empire is often treated as a failed state, and people often refer to that insufferable refrain of Voltaire that the empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire to describe it. While this is a popular sentiment, it is one that mainstream scholarship has largely moved beyond as outdated and based on a very anachronistic notion of what a state should be and what it should work towards. So certainly the empire was not a centralized nation state with a standing army or a written constitution and centralized bureaucratic governance. I mean, who likes centralized bureaucratic governance, really? But while it didn't have it, it didn't really want it either, and it didn't really need it for what it was trying to accomplish. So, what was the empire, and why shouldn't we be so dismissive of its value? So, one of the great strengths of European civilization is the fact that it possessed an overarching culture, which, in short, combined the Greco Roman philosophical and legal inheritance with the moral heart of Christianity and also, sort of philosophical aspects of Christianity, which were also interwoven into that. And this allowed the sharing of ideas and the resolution of conflicts within a common moral and cultural framework. But this was maintained without being dominated by a single massive centralized state, which could stifle competition and innovation. Which matches, for example, the popular perception of China and why it ultimately stagnated, although I think that that's a bit unfair. So the empire was, in a sense, a microcosm of this arrangement in Europe, and it was at the heart of Europe. And by design, it could preserve the uniqueness and diversity of its constituents very capably, but without collapsing into the kind of pervasive instability that characterized other decentralized states of affairs, which were productive as a result, such as ancient Greece or the Warring States period of China. This stabilizing effect extended beyond its borders throughout all of Europe, providing what a contemporary philosopher, who I will name at the very end of this video, as late as the 18th century called a perilous reef for invaders, which served as the true guarantor of European peace and stability, since it barred French and Turk and Swede and Russian alike from running roughshod over Europe in their moments of greatest might. The empire provided a framework in which the weak need not live in constant fear of the strong and of dethronement, which in its absence would be a recipe for endless conflict due to the conquer or be conquered mindset that characterized other extremely decentralized states of affairs. This kind of framework provided an environment that produced a lot of healthy competition, which led to an almost unparalleled efflorescence of culture, of music, of writing, and of science. Goethe famously noted that while France became something of a cultural wasteland as you traveled away from Paris due to its extreme centralization, the empire had numerous worthy cultural centers and, multiple hearts, so to speak, multiple centers of life that gave the entire body politic vitality. So one of the great advantages of this particular constitution was that it was very defensively potent, but it was offensively far less so. So this ensured that while the empire could provide stability, the strength it possessed to do so could not easily be deployed to those on the outside or to those within itself. The princes and the imperial estates were deeply invested in the common defense of the empire, and they contributed significant men and resources well into the end of the 17th century and even into the 18th century, despite the deep religious and social divides that had become more or less permanent after the Peace of Westphalia. Uh, and so, an important thing to note about the Peace of Westphalia that marked the end of the 30 Years' War is it didn't spell the end of the empire. Well, after that point, Protestant princes throughout the empire continued to fund the defense of the empire and against the Turks, for example, and against the French, despite their tremendous confessional differences with the emperor. So, some people might object that this kind of defense of the weak against the strong would be meaningless to anyone except the prince. Princes did not have to live in constant fear of dethronement. But what about the common people? But this isn't true at all. The empire consisted of numerous corporate bodies, from mighty duchies to guilds to associations of knights to medium-sized counties to small villages and manors. And all of these had their own unique rights and obligations that were tailored to their peculiar histories and circumstances. And their very uniqueness inspired fierce loyalty. And these are extremely well protected by the imperial framework. While most of Europe saw the absorption of these sorts of entities and communities by major powers within their respective realms, the empire managed to safeguard their independence with little difficulty until the chaos of the early 19th century, where you have the French Revolutionary Wars. And it would also be a mistake to see it as a confederation of absolute monarchies whose right to run roughshod over their own subjects with an iron heel was being protected. Even common people and immediate subjects who did not owe direct allegiance to the emperor had the right of appeal to the emperor, except in special cases. And this wasn't merely a matter of theory, but it was a matter of fact. You had two competing imperial supreme courts, the Reichskammergericht and the Reichshofrat, the former in Wetzlar and the latter in Vienna. And they took thousands upon thousands of cases and guaranteed justice throughout the empire, really until the later 18th century. Many of the peasantry were very saddened at the loss of the empire and the once ever-present possibility of imperial appeal to protect from the rapacity of princes and the checks that princes and emperor were able to put on one another's power. So the question is then, if this system was so successful and wonderful, why did it ultimately fail? And why did people come to view it as a failure? So we need to understand, firstly, that nothing lasts forever. And even the greatest and most prosperous entities will fall eventually. The Holy Roman Empire lasted over 800 years from the crowning of Otto the Great to the abdication of Francis II in 1806. And as far as empires and institutions go, that is quite a long time to endure. In this case, you had three major factors at work in undermining the empire. So you had the rise of Prussia, the rise of proto-industrialization and modernization, and the French Revolution. And the institutions working for common defense continued to work extremely well until these three factors combined worked to undermine them. So the rise of Prussia, I'll start with that, especially because of its ultimate success in seizing Silesia from Austria due to the miracle of the House of Brandenburg in the 7 Years' War, where Russia randomly switched sides, was a tremendous blow to confidence in and cooperation with imperial institutions, and led to an increasingly bipolar empire, which undermined the cooperation and consensus which was so central to the proper functioning of the imperial constitution. While industrial and so to give a good example, Prussia, as the 18th century wore on, was able to stifle the ability of its subjects to appeal to the emperor until ultimately the emperor had to give them an absolute right of non-appeal, merely as a recognition of their ability to quash and stifle the the desire for their subjects to appeal to imperial courts. Now, while industrialization did not begin in earnest until the 19th century in most of Europe, capitalism and industry required united national markets, and these were starting to emerge in the 18th century. And numerous local corporate rights, local dialects, varying customs, lots of little states, lots of little toll stations serve as a tremendous obstacle to the building of national markets and an integrated economic system. They work extremely well before that was possible or required, but it didn't. But it was a tremendous obstacle afterwards. So this required the building of new, somewhat artificial national identities, which did not supplement but replace the local identities and rights that had existed before, so that the free flow of goods would not be impeded, and so that the free flow of people throughout the nation would not be impeded. And so rights that once protected the weak from exploitation just became obstacles to economic growth. And finally, the French Revolution saw a country, France, cast off all the burdens of tradition, corporate rights, local autonomies, estates. While this ultimately came at a tremendous cost to life and culture and morals in France, it did allow France to tap into a disproportionate amount of its own resources, which lay dormant in every other country of Europe, although this was to a much lesser extent in Britain, and particularly in the Empire. This led to a massive preference cascade, where every state in Europe either needed to radically centralize and reform or perish before the enormous conscripted hordes of a conquering republic. Quite an existential threat. None of these factors were sufficient, though. You might say that the beginnings of economic and technological modernization allowed radical centralization to bear great fruit militarily, and that the rise of Prussia undermined the ability of the imperial states to cooperate against the modernized menace of revolutionary France. Ultimately, what leads us to call the empire a failure is just the conceit that all states have to tend towards a centralized bureaucratic nation state with widespread standardization. While these obviously have their advantages, these advantages became far greater with the advent of industrialization and modernity in general. And there's much to be said for a system that fosters and protects cherished local rights and differences instead of quashing them. And these local rights and differences tend to be far more meaningful and valuable than the one-size-fits-all identities and rights imposed by the modern state. Rights whose very abstractness and universality tend to inspire very little loyalty and little pushback when ultimately and inevitably they're trampled on by the Leviathan that is the modern state. So this is my first video. Naturally, there are a lot of loose ends to address. These will be addressed in future videos. There's a lot about the Imperial Constitution, which I haven't been able to touch upon. I would really like to make a video on the development and history of imperial elections and the Electoral College next. Thank you very much for watching, and this has been Tyrillian, and I'm done.